Hello and welcome to Classic Country Backstories. I'm Colleen Gallagher. Today we got a really special vlog for you. We've been working on this one for a while. It's about the legendary George Jones. It's going to be in two parts. We have a biographical section that you've got to watch first, and then you're going to have to come back because on part two, we talked to somebody that probably knew George better than anybody, talking about his wife, Nancy Jones. So come with us, watch part one, learn about George Jones, and then you can come back and hear the great interview. She was fabulous. You don't want to miss out on this. Come with us on this trip, won't you?
Nashville, Tennessee, country music capital of the world, home of the Grand Ole Opry, where singers and dreamers come seeking stardom. Join me as we learn about the lives and careers of those who built this town on Classic Country Backstories. Today's episode is one of great fame and fortune. It's also a story of the pitfalls of the music industry and struggles with addiction. The primary sources for this episode are mainly from I Live to Tell It All, George Jones' autobiography, and Playin' Possum, My Memories of George Jones, written by George's wife Nancy, along with interviews of George Jones himself. He had 14 number one country hits. Ultimately, he recorded 160 chart singles, more than any other artist in any format in the history of popular music. Over 8 million albums sold, 5-time Grammy Award winner, 9-time CMA Award winner, 3-time Billboard Award winner, and 1 ACM Award. He said in the book of his life, "My talent, though it brought me fame and fortune, never brought me peace of mind." He was born George Glenn Jones, September 12, 1931, in Saratoga, Texas. George was over 12 pounds at birth, and the doctor dropped him, breaking his arm. George remembers listening to the Grand Ole Opry as a child on a battery-operated radio that his parents played on Saturday nights. If he got sleepy, he would ask his family to wake him up if Bill Monroe or Roy Acuff came on. When George was around 9 or 10, his father surprised him by taking him to Jefferson Music Company and bought him a shiny new Gene Autry guitar with a horse and lariat on the front. George was one of 8 children. George's sister Ethel, age 7, died 5 years before George was born. George's father began to drink heavily, and he became abusive to Clara and their children. At one point, George's sister Helen and her husband Dub committed their father to a rehabilitation center for alcoholics. He was sober the last 4 years of his life. George Washington Jones died in 1967. George met a preacher and his wife, Brother Burl and Sister Annie, and they preached and sang the gospel. Annie taught George basic chords. The rest came to him naturally. They let him play and sing in church and at revival gatherings in Kuntz. George taught Brother Burl how to drive, even though he had only driven in their car. When George's father would return from work early enough, the family would sing Pentecostal hymns. His dad played harmonica and George would play the guitar. They would sing till the sun went down, and then they went to bed early as they had no electricity. He would take the guitar to school and hide it in a patch of woods and pull leaves over it so no one would steal it. He would play hooky from school and play his guitar. George went to the 7th grade twice before his parents finally let him quit school. He was just not interested. He was only interested in music. George played his first paying gig at 11, up on a shoeshine stand in front of an arcade on the main street of Beaumont, Texas. He got up on the stand and began playing. Someone put a cup near his feet. Before long, he had 15 or 20 people watching him, and they were throwing nickels and dimes down while he was singing. He sang every song he knew 2 or 3 times and made more than $24, which was a lot of money in 1942. He played for free in local taverns just to play, and he played on the streets of Beaumont for tips as a teenager. George began playing in Texas dance halls and made his way to radio, working with a man and wife duo, Eddie and Pearl. With them, he worked 4 nights a week in the dance halls, 5 hours a week on the radio, and weekends at Playground Park, an amusement park. George married his first wife, Dorothy, at the age of 17. His parents had to sign legal papers for the marriage. Dorothy became pregnant. Due to lack of money and pressures from her parents, they were divorced before their child, Susan, was even born. When George could not make his child support payments, he was put in jail. His sister Lois and her husband bailed him out. He knew he would end up back in jail for non-support, so he joined the U.S. Marines. He was stationed in San Jose, California. He met a nightclub owner and radio personality who hired him to work on Saturday nights when he didn't have duty. During this time, he began to drink heavily. George came out of the service in November of 1953 and went back to Beaumont. He went to work as a disc jockey on KTRM radio about a year after his discharge. He used this opportunity to plug his shows, which helped him to build a following. Jack Starnes and Pappy Daly, owners of Starday Records, contacted him. They'd heard a couple of his recordings played on the radio. They signed him to their record label. His first session was in 1954, and he was 24 years old. Originally, Jones tried to sing like his musical influences, Hank Williams, Roy Acuff, and Lefty Frizzell. Eventually, at the suggestion of Pappy Daly, he developed his own singing style. In 1954, George was playing in Houston when he met Shirley Corley, a car hop at the Princess Drive-In. After a short courtship, George and Shirley were married. They were married for 14 years and had 2 sons, Jeffrey and Brian. Jones said he gave her a lot of grief. She was not happy that she was married to an entertainer. When they moved to Nashville, she stayed for 3 months, then returned to Texas. He said that she was a good mother and a good woman. In 1955, he had his first top 10 hit with Why Baby Why that went to number 4. In early 1956, George was asked to be a guest on the Grand Ole Opry. They told him he couldn't play his guitar since he wasn't in the Union. He was a nervous wreck. George Morgan and Jimmy Dickens tried to calm him down. One of them put a guitar around his neck and said they'd take the responsibility. According to his book, Jones was in such a nervous fog he couldn't remember much about the first appearance. George was asked to be a member and was inducted on August 25, 1956. His first number 1 was White Lightnin', released March 9, 1959 for Mercury Records. He topped the Billboard chart for 5 weeks and remained on the chart for 22 weeks. The song was written by J.P. Richardson, known as the Big Bopper. Sadly, Richardson was killed in a plane crash on February 3, 1959. He did not live to see his song reach number 1. Buddy Killen, bass player on the session, who later became the president of Tree Publishing Company, said that Jones was drinking heavily that day, and they recorded 83 takes before they had a take they could actually use. The word slug was slurred in the recording because George was drunk. The name Possum came from T. Tommy Cottrell. He was a disc jockey. He saw Jones on his first album cover. He had a burr haircut that was popular at the time. Cottrell said the picture reminded him of Pogo, a cartoon possum in a comic strip. Cottrell started calling him Possum, and people got a kick out of that. At first, however, George Jones was not happy about the name, but he got over it. As his fame grew, so did his dependence on alcohol. He became unpredictable and sometimes even violent. The actions brought on missed shows and eventually lawsuits. Most of us have heard some version of George Jones driving his lawnmower to find a liquor store when all his keys were hidden. However, there were many more stories about George's drinking days. While on a binge, he bought a '98 Oldsmobile, then apparently drove around asking everyone, "How do you like my red Buick?" George Riddle, longtime band member of the Jones Boys, said that George came off the road with as many injuries as some folks who fought in the Vietnam War. Jones was known for looking for fights when he was under the influence. He was notorious for fighting and firing his band members only to rehire them again. George said he probably had about 200 Jones Boys. George recorded for United Artists from 1962 to 1965. He then signed with Musicorps Records, his 4th label in 11 years. He went on to record 280 songs for them, 32 of them being singles. On April 14, 1962, George released She Thinks I Still Care. It was on the Billboard survey for 23 weeks, with 6 weeks at number 1. On May 4, 1963, George and Melba Montgomery released We Must Have Been Out of Our Minds. The song rose to number 3 and was on the Billboard charts for 28 weeks. George fell for Melba in spite of the fact that he was already married. George asked her to marry him, and she said no. She began dating Jack Solomon and married him in 1968. According to Jones' account of his life, by 1964 he was missing perhaps 10% of his shows because he was too drunk to get to them or too drunk to go on after he got there. He was touring with Buck Owens. George didn't care about closing. He actually liked to go first, but Buck said he would close the show this night. And George thought he would take his turn, so he said he would go first that night. Buck and George had a disagreement, and George went on first. However, George went out and did all of Buck's songs just to be funny. When Jones came off the stage, he looked at Buck and said, "You're on." Buck wasn't amused. He went out and did just about the same show that George had just done. Another time, George walked on stage in a pair of baggy Bermuda shorts in the middle of a tender ballad. Buck Owens laughed about these events in a 1994 interview for George's book. One night, while Johnny Paycheck was a member of the Jones Boys, during a show in Fairfax, Virginia, George told Johnny that he wouldn't come out and sing unless he was introduced as Hank Williams. Hank had been dead for 11 years. After arguing, Paycheck went to the microphone and introduced him as Hank Williams. Jones didn't budge. Johnny stomped toward him. Jones then said he wasn't going to go out until he was introduced as Johnny Horton. Paycheck threatened to beat Jones up if he didn't come out. Then he returned to the stage to introduce him as Johnny Horton. George Jones came on stage, sang the first half of the first line of White Lightning, then left the stage. The crowd rioted. Meanwhile, George Jones left the venue, and it took the band and the Fairfax Police Department at least 3 hours to find him. Walk Through This World with Me topped the charts for 2 weeks during the spring of 1967. This was his first #1 in 5 years, with She Thinks I Still Care being his last. In 1967, George opened the first Possum Holler Club, a 500-seat theater on Nashville's legendary Lower Broadway Street. It was a popular hangout for the country stars of that time. According to Jones, he met Tammy Wynette in 1966. She was married to songwriter Don Chappell, who was also fronting her shows. Jones and Wynette shared a booking agency, so their paths crossed occasionally. He said he was immediately drawn to Tammy. She was touring and promoting her first hit, Apartment Number 9. George even recorded some of Chappell's songs, including When the Grass Grows Over Me, which went to #2 for 2 weeks on the Billboard chart. Then George and Tammy began performing together. They did Elusive Dreams, which was a single for her and David Houston. George said they were traveling together, singing and laughing. He said they weren't doing anything wrong, except falling in love. George went to Tammy and Don's house one afternoon and had a few drinks. Next thing they knew, Tammy and Don were arguing, and George was in the middle of it. When Don asked why he was interfering, George told Don that he was in love with Tammy and that she loved him too. Tammy packed her daughters up and she left with George. He took Tammy and her 3 kids to a motel, then he went home. The next day, they were living in his house. In less than 24 hours, he bought her a new Lincoln Continental. He didn't have an engagement ring, so he took the ring off his hand and gave it to her. They flew to Mexico so she could get a divorce from Don Chappell, then found out that Mexican divorces weren't accepted in the U.S. Then she found out that she wasn't legally married to Don Chappell anyway. She'd been married to Don less than a year after she divorced her first husband, which was illegal in Alabama, where they were married and divorced. George Jones and Tammy Wynette were married on February 16, 1969 in Ringgold, Georgia. For the first time, George was happy, and he began to drink less. He said his happiness peaked when Tammy told him she was pregnant. George bought a house that he called their dream house in Lakeland, Florida. He called it the Plantation. Repairs were needed to the home, so George had it remodeled before the family moved in. Eventually, George and Tammy opened the old Plantation Music Park on the grounds of their home. Their daughter, Tamala Georgette, was born in 1970. George continued recording at Music Core with such hits as She Thinks I Still Care, The Race Is On, A Good Year for the Roses, and Walk Through This World with Me. George continued hanging out with his old drinking buddies, and eventually his drinking escalated once again. George and Tammy's relationship was stormy, and George's irrational behavior often put him in the spotlight. George admitted that there were some rough times, but he never drew a firearm at Tammy, as she reported more times than one. After one incident, Tammy had George committed to a mental hospital while she went on tour. When he was released, he returned home to find his dream home practically destroyed. She said he had torn the place up. George said that he had done a lot of things, but that he didn't destroy their Florida mansion or shoot it full of holes. He also said he never fired a gun at Tammy Wynette. In 1971, he signed with Epic Records and worked with producer Billy Sherrill. They recorded songs like Grand Tour and Bartender Blues, among many more. Sherrill also produced duets with George's wife Tammy, chart-topping hits such as We're Gonna Hold On, Golden Ring, and Near You. By the time Golden Ring and Near You hit in 1976, the couple were divorced. After George Jones' hospital stay, he remained sober for several weeks. Then he went on another binge for 2 or 3 days. One day, Tammy had enough, so she took the kids and she was gone. She filed papers to sue George Jones for divorce. George then told Tammy that he would try hard to stop drinking forever. She withdrew the divorce petition. George was sober for close to a year. They sold their Florida home and moved to Nashville, where they bought 3 homes. They were doing well financially and personally. On September 12, 1971, Tammy turned 40, and George didn't drink a drop. On April 13, 1974, George's mother died. Shortly after, George began binge drinking again. Tammy left George. Then Tammy was hospitalized for a drug overdose. Was it accidental? Was it over the separation from George Jones? George tried to contact Tammy, but she never answered his phone calls. Once more, Tammy filed for divorce. George did not contest it and didn't even go to court. He said she could have whatever she wanted. Their divorce was final on March 21, 1975. Ironically, Tammy and George continued to work together for a short time. I saw an appearance on Pop Goes the Country where Tammy and George were after their divorce. Ralph Emery asked Tammy why their marriage broke up. She said it was because of his nipping. He said he was just being sociable. The song No Show Jones was a true song and even had license plates that said No Show 1 and No Show 2. He said he wasn't laughing at what he did, but it was just his way of dealing with the things he had done. George opened the second Possum Holler the same day his divorce from Tammy was granted. It was located in historic Printer's Alley in Nashville. He was not the actual owner, but he allowed his name to be used. The club was intended to be a place for the band to work when they were not on the road with George. The owner was Shug Baggett, a veteran Nashville nightclub owner who owned several other clubs before the Possum Holler. Jones said the no-show thing was blown out of proportion, although he admits it did happen. He said that sometimes concert promoters would actually double book him. He said that he didn't miss all the dates he was accused of. He said there were club dates that were advertised that he wasn't even booked on. The club owners had to give people their admission back, but the customer usually bought and paid for drinks and dinner before they knew George wouldn't be there. By the time his third marriage failed, George Jones made his most dramatic downward spiral yet. By 1979, he was homeless and destitute. Then he recorded He Stopped Loving Her Today. This became his first hit in 5 years. For this song, he won CMA Best Male Vocal and Top Single Awards. He won CMA's Top Male Vocalist in 1980 and 1981. He also won a Grammy for Best Male Vocal Country Performance. In 1983, George married Nancy Ford Sepulvado. George continued to drink heavily. George signed with MCA Records in 1990 and began a successful time in his life. He was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 1992. In 1994, George and Tammy returned to the studio to record the album One. The single One was released on June the 25th, 1995. It was the duet's 9th and final album together. It had been nearly 17 years since they had last recorded together. He recorded a guest vocal on Patti Loveless's song You Don't Seem to Miss Me, which became his final top 20 country hit. The song won Loveless and Jones CMA's top vocal event in 1998. In 1999, George nearly lost his life in a car accident. George was driving in his Lexus, apparently fumbling with the radio, when his vehicle swerved across the highway, slammed into a concrete bridge, demolishing a section of the bridge before hurling him into the water below. He did not appear to be wearing a seatbelt. It took rescuers more than 2 hours to extract Jones from the mangled vehicle. Although it was commonly thought that George Jones had already given up the bottle, George later admitted he was under the influence when he had the accident. According to Nancy Jones' book, Playing Possum, My Memories of George Jones, George flatlined twice in the helicopter on the way to the hospital. X-rays showed that he had a punctured lung, a ruptured liver, and his legs were badly mangled, among other internal injuries. The doctor told Nancy he probably wasn't going to live. He was in ICU for more than a week, then another week and a half while he recovered. On advice from Alan Jackson, Nancy had the bus brought to the hospital so she could rest without going home. One morning, she walked down the hall to visit and heard him singing Me and Jesus. She knew he was back. One of the nurses at the nurse's station told Nancy, "He's been awake for about 30 minutes and he hasn't shut up." On the way from the hospital, he told Nancy that he believed he died and came back. He said he saw a huge eagle that picked him up, put George on his back, and flew him above the clouds. George had some setbacks over the next few months, but he promised God if he'd let him get over this, he would never drink or smoke again. It was during this time that Jones began the process of rehabilitating himself. He often credited his marriage to Nancy for helping him get off drugs and alcohol and prolonging his life. She was his wife, his best friend, and his manager. Jones resumed touring. This time around, he was consistently on the road without missing shows. Although he often laughed about the No-Show Jones label, he often felt pangs of remorse for letting his fans down in those early days. In 2008, George Jones was given the Kennedy Center's Lifetime Achievement Award, which is one of the nation's top arts awards. In 2012, he received the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. His health was declining, so in late 2012, George Jones announced his farewell tour. November 22, 2013, was to be George's final show at the sold-out Bridgestone Arena in Nashville. Set to perform were Alan Jackson, Garth Brooks, Randy Travis, Charlie Daniels, Kenny Rogers, the Oak Ridge Boys, and many more. However, it was not to be for George Jones. George paid many visits to the hospital in 2012 and 2013. Nancy Jones stated in her book that George knew he was dying, and he was trying to prepare her. On April 24, 2013, George slipped into a semi-comatose condition and never fully regained consciousness. George Jones passed away in the early morning hours of April 26, 2013. He was 81 years old. A private memorial was held for family and friends at the local funeral home on May 1st. George's children, Susan, Jeffrey, Brian, and Georgette, were in attendance, along with Nancy. Fans found out the location and gathered outside the funeral home. When Nancy was told of the vigil being held outside, she invited them in to pay their respects. She figures George would have wanted it that way. A public funeral service was held at the Grand Ole Opry House on May 2nd, 2013. Fans lined up the day before the service to pay their respects. More than 4,000 were in attendance. WSM Radio's Eddie Stubbs and Keith Bilbrey hosted the service, with Jones pastor Mike Wilson officiating. Randy Travis, Brad Paisley, Ronnie Millsap, Vince Gill, Patty Loveless, Tanya Tucker, Winona, the Oak Ridge Boys, and Alan Jackson all performed. Former First Lady Laura Bush spoke, as did Tennessee Governor Bill Haslam, former Governor of Arkansas Mike Huckabee, CBS reporter Bob Schieffer, Kenny Chesney, Charlie Daniels, and Barbara Mandrell. As the service concluded, George's casket was wheeled up the center aisle, followed by the family, as the voice of George Jones filled the Opry House one more time with "When the Last Curtain Falls." The audience fell silent in respect for George as he passed them one last time. George Jones is buried at Woodlawn Memorial Park in Berry Hill, Tennessee, just outside Nashville. There's a huge monument marking George's final resting place. What was supposed to be George Jones' final show on November 22, 2013, became a tribute show. More than 100 artists turned out to honor him, and it was sold out. Charlie Daniels, Garth Brooks, Kathy Mattea, Craig Morgan, Miranda Lambert, Martina McBride, and many others performed. Vince Gill showed up in a t-shirt that read Sweet Pea, the name that George affectionately called Vince. As at George's funeral, his empty rocking chair sat on stage front and center through the evening. There was no one else like George Jones. When his voice comes on the radio, you can immediately identify it. His music spanned over 6 decades, and with folks like you, his music will live on. On November 15, 2024, George Jones' The Lost Nashville Sessions was released. It's an amazing project. Go get you some George Jones music. That wraps up another episode of Classic Country Backstories. Please hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell notifications for future episodes. Until next time, God bless, take care, and I'll see you later.